Most people expect sadness after a divorce. They may expect anger. What they don't expect is the ambivalence, the way grief and relief can arrive at the same time, sometimes within the same hour. After a long marriage ends, many people find themselves not with one clear emotion, but with several contradictory ones, none of which feel entirely safe to express. This is a closer look at why that happens, and what the research tells us about what these emotions actually mean. Psychologists who study divorce in midlife consistently distinguish it from other kinds of loss by one central feature: ambiguity. When a marriage ends, the other person doesn't disappear. They remain in shared custody arrangements, in mutual friendships, in the small, practical structures that take months or years to fully separate. The grief doesn't have a single, clear object. It keeps finding new things to attach to. Pauline Boss, a family therapist who spent decades studying what she called ambiguous loss, observed that this kind of grief is often harder to resolve than bereavement, because the mind continues to search for an endpoint that doesn't exist in a clean or legible form. When grief has no clear boundaries, the emotions it produces don't have clear boundaries either. Anger, guilt, sadness, numbness, and relief are not separate responses to separate events. They are different expressions of the same underlying loss, and they frequently occur together. Guilt tends to be the emotion people carry most quietly after a long divorce. For the person who initiated the separation, it often takes the form of a persistent question: was the damage I caused proportionate to what I was trying to resolve? For the person who didn't see it coming, it takes a different shape: a search for what was missed, what could have been different, what personal failure the outcome reveals. Research on self-blame following divorce consistently identifies it as one of the strongest predictors of prolonged psychological distress. Not the divorce itself, but the ongoing internal judgment that follows it. When guilt becomes chronic, it stops functioning as a moral signal and begins functioning as a repetitive cognitive loop. Recognizing that distinction is, clinically speaking, one of the more useful early steps in processing this kind of loss. Anger after the end of a long marriage has a particular quality that distinguishes it from anger in other contexts. It is rarely directed only at the other person. More often, it is directed at time, at the accumulation of years that, in retrospect, feel different than they did while being lived. Studies on divorce in midlife note that anger during this period is frequently displaced onto secondary targets: children, friends, minor circumstances. This is partly because the actual source of the anger, the marriage itself and everything it represented, is too large and too historically entangled to confront in a single, direct way. Clinically, anger in this context tends to signal that something mattered, which is a different thing than saying it is simply an obstacle to recovery. When anger is processed honestly, it often carries information. When it calcifies into a fixed interpretive frame, a way of narrating an entire life, its function changes. The distinction between anger as a phase of grief and bitterness as a permanent position is one that therapists working with this population frequently return to. If this is useful to you, subscribing to the channel and leaving a like helps this kind of content reach more people who are going through the same thing. Relief is the post-divorce emotion that people are least likely to name out loud, and most likely to feel ashamed of when they do. For people who have been in marriages that stopped functioning effectively, sometimes years before the formal separation, the end of the relationship can produce a recognizable reduction in tension. The particular low-grade stress that characterizes a deteriorating marriage has an end point, and for many people, the nervous system registers that end before the mind has found a socially acceptable framework for acknowledging it. Therapists who work with people in the early post-divorce period describe relief as one of the most consistently misread emotions in this context. The common interpretation that relief signals indifference or that it retroactively diminishes the value of the marriage is not supported by what the clinical evidence shows. Relief does not indicate that the relationship was unimportant. In many cases, it indicates the opposite, that the tension of its deterioration had been present long enough and had been carried at sufficient cost that the body registers its absence as significant. Relief and grief are not mutually exclusive. They are frequently concurrent. The research on emotional complexity following major life transitions supports the idea that holding contradictory emotional states simultaneously is not a sign of confusion or pathology. It is a characteristic feature of how the mind processes loss at this level of scale. The most consistent finding across research on post-divorce adjustment in midlife is not about which emotion people feel. It is about how they relate to the emotions they are feeling. People who approach post-divorce emotions as problems to be resolved, who try to eliminate the guilt, suppress the anger, explain away the relief, tend to experience longer and more difficult adjustment periods than those who develop a capacity to hold multiple emotional states without forcing premature resolution. Acceptance-based approaches in clinical psychology describe this as emotional flexibility, the ability to observe what one is feeling without immediately acting to neutralize it or impose a coherent narrative on it. Grief and relief can coexist. Anger and goodwill can coexist. Guilt and the genuine belief that the decision was correct can coexist. These are not contradictions in the logical sense. They are the emotional residue of a long, complex relationship, one that contained both good and bad years, and that mattered enough to generate a substantial loss when it ended. The emotional complexity that most people experience after a long divorce is not a symptom of something going wrong in the recovery process. It is a proportionate response to the scale of what was lost. The emotions that surface after a long marriage ends, however contradictory, however difficult to name, are not obstacles to processing the loss. They are part of the process itself. Decades of shared life leave a significant psychological imprint. The grief that follows their dissolution is proportionate to what was built. And the complexity of that grief, the anger alongside the guilt, the relief alongside the sadness, reflects the complexity of what actually existed, not a failure to respond correctly to its ending. If you're in the middle of this, leave a comment below with one word for what you're feeling right now. Not an explanation, just a word. You'll find you're not alone in it. Subscribe if you want to continue through this together. The next video looks at something closely related: the specific kind of loneliness that follows a long divorce, why it differs from other forms of isolation, and what the research tells us about how people move through it.